would very much welcome your questions during the discussion. Before we launch into the discussion, though, I just wanted to take my moderator's prerogative just briefly to rebut, if you will, a couple of the statements by Tom and Susan and by David. It is true that many of the cases that have been brought and settled in this area have involved alleged or even proven false or misleading statements, but not every investigation and not every case does involve false or misleading statements. There are numerous investigations and cases that involve truthful off-label statements. The right-hand box that I referred to earlier, and I think it is critically important to keep that in mind. And it is that fact that drives the defense bar's passion here. The government was very expressive and passionate in its beliefs that false or misleading statements need to be addressed either criminally or civilly. The manufacturer's perspective is equally passionate that truthful, non-misleading statements that can benefit the health of patients should not be prosecuted criminally or civilly, and indeed, as we'll talk about in a minute, may in fact be protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution. So with that backdrop, Susan, if I could perhaps start with you here. We started, Kirsten started off by talking about the fundamental prohibitions in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that, at least colloquially, are understood to prohibit certain forms of promotional conduct, if you will. And on the other hand, she pointed out that by regulation or by policy, there are various forms of communication that the FDA permits, so-called scientific exchange, the dissemination of reprints, support for CME, responding to unsolicited questions by doctors and the like. In a kind of loose sense, I tend to divide the world into promotion versus non-promotion, or promotion versus education. And I don't believe that educational statements can give rise to criminal or civil liability. I wonder if you could address your perspective on whether there is a divide, and if so, where that line is.
The devil's always in the details in these questions. You know, there are certain exceptions in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and you will not see a case that's brought solely on distribution of peer-reviewed literature, assuming that peer-reviewed literature doesn't contain false and misleading statements, or just unsolicited responses to a physician's request for information. What we actually see, and the reason I have trouble with Paul's question, is pharmaceutical manufacturers who, for example, blast out responses to physician information requests, which are sham requests. They never existed to start with. Representatives who walk around and hand them out, regardless of whether a physician asks for them or not. Continuing medical education that is supposedly independent, but we learn in the course of the investigation was set up, controlled, the speaker picked, the subject matter discussed, the slides in fact created in part by the pharmaceutical company, and that passes as continuing medical education that's independent. Peer-reviewed journal articles, which should be able for our doctors to rely on them when they pick up the New England Journal of Medicine or the internal annals of what?
Annals of
Internal Medicine. And those articles should be accurate. But it again depends on if you've had, for example, a pharmaceutical company that has ghost-written the article, left out significant information out of that article, only put in what they wanted someone to see, suppress the negative information, then the article itself doesn't contain truthful, non-misleading speech. So, Paul, I have trouble at the foundation of the question because inevitably we're looking under the question of if it was true that something was an unsolicited response to A doctor asked a question, and the pharmaceutical representative called medical information back at pharmaceutical headquarters, and they gave truthful, non-misleading speech to that doctor about it. We wouldn't be interested in that. We wouldn't be interested in true scientific exchange. That's what's supposed to happen out there. What concerns us as prosecutors, and I know you say that there are cases out there that involve truthful, non-misleading speech. I don't know of them. I don't know of those investigations. And I know when we don't have endless resources. We're trying to clean up an industry. So from our perspective, it's to pick the bad ones and to pursue those things that will deter other people from doing the same.
Kristen, I suspect you have a somewhat different perspective.
I do, but I think part of it too is it's difficult because when what you hear is really examples of the worst, it's too easy to think that these lines are really black and white. As a starting point, I'd like to just sort of ground us in the regulation that has really triggered a lot of this discussion. When I went through the introduction, I mentioned that a lot of the things, including the recent guidance on reprints, has that black box warning that this is not legally binding on FDA or anyone else. Well, there is a regulation that the Food Drug and that the FDA has created. It's been out there for a long time. It's specifically in the context of investigational new drug applications, but FDA has recognized it applies more generally. And the basic statement is that while a sponsor shall not represent in a promotional context that a new drug is safe or effective for an investigational purpose, this is not intended to restrict the full exchange of scientific information concerning the drug, including dissemination of scientific findings in scientific or lay media. The intent is to restrict promotional claims, not full scientific exchange. I think as a starting point for understanding the promotional versus scientific exchange discussion, need to do two things. Number one, focus on the fact that the line that we need to draw here is a line that is within the kind of conduct that you could expect a for-profit pharmaceutical company to engage in, which means when you're trying to decide what is promotional context and what is true scientific exchange, you're not comparing what a pharmaceutical company does to what a wholly independent academic medical center might do with no pharmaceutical involvement whatsoever. You're comparing scientific speech by a pharmaceutical manufacturer to promotional speech by a pharmaceutical manufacturer. It matters that this is a for-profit company. Even when a pharmaceutical company is making decisions about what scientific research to fund, how to conduct that research, how to publish it, and how to communicate about it to customers and to the scientific community, this is a for-profit company. And so there will be discussion within the company of the business impact of all of those decisions. That doesn't render those communications any less scientific, and it doesn't turn everything that the pharmaceutical company does into a promotional statement. So for example, if you have discussion within a company about whether to pursue scientific research,